Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all, and particularly our speakers, Lucy Moore, Audrey Niffenegger, as well as this session's chairperson, Nicolette Jones, to the Charleston Festival. The common theme of this session, ballet, is one that strikes a chord at Charleston. Bloomsbury was entranced and inspired by the visits of the Ballets Russes to London. So much so that Maynard Keynes, a frequent visitor to the house, married Lydia Lopakova, a member of the company. Nijinsky reciprocated this fascination by setting his erotic ballet Jeu in a typical Bloomsbury square. Audrey Niffenegger is the author of the international bestsellers The Time Traveller's Wife and Her Fearful Symmetry. She's published 3 illustrated books prior to her current fairy tale, Raven Girl, which was commissioned by Wayne McGregor and will be performed by the Royal Ballet for the first time this Friday? This Friday. This evening, Audrey will talk a little bit about the transformation of Raven Girl into a ballet. Lucy Moore is an author and broadcaster whose work includes the best-selling Maharinis, The Lives and Times of 3 Generations of Indian Princesses. Her new biography of Nijinsky, published to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the Rite of Spring, has just appeared. Stravinsky said that the Rite of Spring was his homage to the power of nature to transform the fierce Russian winter into the joy of spring. Lucy Moore will talk about her life of Nijinsky, the god of dance, and the first interpreter of the Rite of Spring. Nicolette Jones is a writer, journalist, and author specialising in literature and the arts. Now I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who will talk a little bit, followed by Audrey, and then they'll have a conversation, and after that invite questions from the audience. Lucy Moore.
Hello. Can everyone hear? Is that working? Well, I've written a book about Nijinsky, the dancer, one of those names that everybody knows. A lot of my husband's friends were rudely asking questions about racehorses. Actually, it's the other way around. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Nijinsky's life. In the book, I definitely came to the book because of the Rite of Spring and because of the Ballets Russes, rather than knowing, I learned about Nijinsky through the Ballets Russes in general, and then this particular sort of interest in the Rite of Spring and that first performance, which, everybody, that the idea of the riot and the people, the gentlemen in top hats banging each other's knuckles with their walking sticks, in that first performance. But the more I learned about that night, the more I felt that Nijinsky's voice hadn't really been heard, partly because he went mad not long afterwards, and also he was pretty articulate in normal life, and pretty inarticulate, and so he was no match for the sort of the Diaghilevs, the Stravinskys, the guys who are very good at creating and promoting an image of their own, in that, they wanted to create a sort of fame for themselves, and Nijinsky wasn't really interested in that. He was interested in his art. So he was born in the late 19th century. He was the child of 2 itinerant Polish dancers who were obviously very talented, but not talented enough and not ambitious and focused enough to get into the Tsar's imperial theatres in St. Petersburg. So I always feel that he's a little bit like Picasso, this guy who was brought up immersed in a world. He couldn't help but be, whether or not he was going to be a genius at dance, he couldn't help but be good at it. He knew that he was immersed in the vocabulary of it as a small child. And he also had what someone like Charlie Chaplin had as well, this kind of access to a kind of music hall or musical theatre tradition as well, because his father was choreographing ballets in these kind of big theatre circuses that toured the provinces of Imperial Russia. And so when he was 9, having had this very varied, almost gypsy-like childhood, where one minute they'd be rich enough to be able to afford a nanny for the children to be looked after while they were performing, and the next minute they would be, the children would be left on their own for 3 hours while they went off to, there's great variation in fortune in their childhood. And when the parents split up, Nijinsky was 8 or 9. His mother was desperate to get him into the Imperial Theatre School. She pulled every string she could to get him there. And he was immediately noted by his teachers as being one of the great future talents of his generation. And also immediately loathed by his contemporaries for being so good. There's a terrible incident in his childhood where his classmates tried to persuade him to show them how high he could jump, and he ran up to this huge sort of music stand, which they had spread soap on the floor in front of it, and he literally was in a coma for 5 days after that. These were the people who he went on to dance alongside for the rest of his career. A lot of them also joined the Ballets Russes. I mean, there were only 6 kids in his class, boys in his class, but 3 or 4 of them would dance with him in the Ballets Russes as well. So it's quite a sort of tense childhood, and yet the undercurrent of it is always a devotion to art. He and his sister, Bronya Nijinsky, who became a celebrated dancer and choreographer in her own right, were always passionate about art and were very much brought up by their mother to believe that art was the greatest ideal, the highest thing that you could devote yourself to. So Nijinsky left the Imperial Theatre School, the ballet school. He very quickly, it's the modern, the escapades at the Bolshoi of today are very similar to what was happening in early 20th century Russia. It was absolutely accepted for a dancer to go under the protection of a rich lover who would pay their bills and introduce them to the right people. Anna Pavlova did it, most of them were willing to sort of make what Nijinsky described as a sacrifice. Although I think it went both ways. That the protector or the lover, would have genuinely wanted to see their friend succeed, I think. And certainly in the case of Nijinsky's first lover, who's called Prince Lvov, he tried to introduce Nijinsky to Diaghilev because he knew that Diaghilev could help Nijinsky's career. So the great meeting really in Nijinsky's life is with Diaghilev, who was his great champion and the creator really of his stage image in many ways, although exactly where the line is drawn between Nijinsky and Diaghilev is hard to define. And for me, the sort of heart of the story of Nijinsky and Diaghilev is this moment when Diaghilev and Nijinsky have become lovers, but sort of sporadically. Diaghilev still has another lover around the place. They've come to Paris. They've had this triumphant season, the first season of the Ballets Russes, where Nijinsky's been acclaimed as the god of the dance. He's at this stage 20 years old. It's really his first moment when he becomes, his kind of future's fame is set. And Nijinsky got typhoid and was ill in bed, recuperating for a month. And Diaghilev came in and sat on his bed and said to him, "I want you to live with me, and I will pay all your bills, and I'll pay your mother a pension every month, and you will essentially be mine." And I think for Diaghilev, I get the feeling that this was a sort of romantic association. He believed that their living and working together was very much bound up together. And for Nijinsky, I think there was simply nowhere else he could go. I mean, he knew he couldn't work in the way he wanted to if he went back to Russia. I mean, he did go back to Russia and still dance for the Mariinsky, but he was already under Diaghilev's protection by this time. And I think there just wasn't somewhere else that he could achieve what he wanted to achieve creatively anywhere else. I suppose I should talk a bit about why Nijinsky was... Do you want me to do that now or later? Why he was special? I don't know how...
Give us, a couple minutes on that would be very interesting.
Yeah. It's fair. And Diaghilev didn't like his dancers to be filmed, partly because he knew that film, it's very jerky in those days. He wasn't going to do them justice. But I think he was also quite superstitious and... So none of those early performances, it's very rare. Occasionally snippets of it come up and people post them on YouTube in great excitement. And you can see odd bits of Nijinsky being sort of kind of a pastiche of, it looks like he's moving, but I don't think none of them are real of him anyway. But for me, one of the most interesting things about Nijinsky was trying to recapture what people saw when they watched him dance. And people who saw him dance write about him in a different way than they do about other people. Even the other greats, even Marie Taglioni in the early 19th century, even Anna Pavlova, what Nijinsky seemed to have was this kind of otherworldly essence. A lot of people at the time thought that he was effeminate, or that he, because of this known association with Diaghilev, that they assumed that he was a sort of, an emasculated man. And certainly him dancing in one of his most famous roles as a flower, as a rose, didn't do anything to dispel those images. And there's a brilliant letter to the Times published in 1913, bemoaning the negative influence that Nijinsky was having on the youth of today. He may be a great artist, but think of the languor of the opium pipe that his dancing conveys to the youth of today. So there was that side of things, but actually he was enormously masculine and virile in other roles. And I think his sexuality was not an issue to him, I don't think. I mean, in his private life, I think it was, but he was not on stage trying to present an effeminate man, or even he just wanted to present the roles. And I think that sense of the roles being soul deep is what the critics always say. And as if he's in a fairy tale, actually, I do think there is an element of Nijinsky's kind of ability to immerse himself in roles, which it was almost as if he only truly lived on stage, and that's what he gave the audience. And I think that's part of what makes his later tragedies so poignant, is the sense that he really did only live on stage, and when he couldn't live on stage for various practical reasons, he couldn't really live at all.
Wonderful, thank you, Lucy. We'll pick up some of these ideas and thoughts a bit later, but I'm going to ask Audrey to tell us a little bit about how her ballet to be came about, the origins of Raven Girl. Tell us what happened.
I feel like I'm a little bit too far to actually. There we go. Yeah. I'll just sort of lean forward in a kind of weird tilt. So flash forward 100 years. The ballet that we're talking about premieres on Friday, so it is indeed a ballet to be. And it's funny to think of history as being kind of fluid and having to be rediscovered or rethought or reimagined, because of course as an artist making something that doesn't exist yet, that's exactly what you're doing. You're trying to pull the thing into being, and it's funny to think of an accomplished fact as being kind of like that. Back in about 2005, I got an email from a man named David Drew, who I didn't know. And this email was about the length of my arm. And David had been given one of my books called The Three Incestuous Sisters, which is a picture book for grown-ups, as you might imagine, for his birthday by his wife, June. And he looked at it and immediately thought, oh, this should be a ballet. And being wonderful, marvelous David, who I didn't know yet, he sat down and emailed me. And reading this email, at that point in my life, I was getting a lot of email from strangers, and usually I was like, oh, thank you very much, that's so nice, and then I would just kind of forget it. But this email was extraordinary because David was a principal dancer with the Royal Ballet back in the 60s and 70s, and so he had continued on and was teaching with the company and was still doing character parts. And so his invitation was very specific. He invited me to come and meet him and sort of become acquainted with the Royal Ballet, and I thought, wow, this sounds extraordinary. And so the next time I was in London, we met up. It was sort of like a date, although he's in his 70s. So it was a strange artistic meeting of like minds. And so what David started doing, because he rapidly realized that I was a ballet idiot, I didn't know much of anything. Obviously, I'd gone to some ballets over the years and had a basic notion of what a ballet might be, but most of the dance I've seen was much more modern. I would go to see people like Meredith Monk. And so being introduced to the Royal Ballet kind of backward. I watched a lot of rehearsals and spent a lot of time in the cafeteria hanging out with people. And after months and months and possibly years of that, I started to go to actual performances. So it was kind of an odd, strange piecemeal education. But David is such a natural teacher, and so he would explain to me not only the workings of the organization, but also just how a ballet comes to be. And what he was looking for was a choreographer who would take an interest in my work and want to make it into a ballet. And eventually, David introduced me to Wayne McGregor. How many of you are familiar with Wayne McGregor? Okay, yeah, a few. So Wayne also came to dance. His training was not in classical ballet, but in contemporary dance, and he's the resident choreographer for the Royal Ballet. He's a person of extraordinary energy, and he's very willing to bring dance into all kinds of settings. So he's worked on the Harry Potter films. He has done a lot of work for Tom York of Radiohead. So it's not just ballerinas and all the formal parts of it. And he also takes an interest in the visual arts quite a lot. And so Wayne looked at my books and said, yes, let's do something, but let's do something new. Let's not just rework this thing that already exists, but let's take a collaborative stance and decide what we're going to do and then do it together. Which, of course, as an artist, that's just what you want to hear. That's where all the excitement and energy lies. And I said, okay, so what do you want to do? Because Wayne's work is, until now, almost exclusively abstract. And Wayne said, well, let's do a new fairy tale. And I said, okay, that's great. And he said, let's make it a dark one. And I said, well, there really aren't any other kinds. And so this was just great, and I just thought, wow, this is just really what I want to do. And so then I went off and thought about it, and I already had a character all ready-made and sitting around doing nothing. Back in 2002, the magazine Harper's ran an essay called Dr. Daedalus, which was by Lauren Slater, and she had written about a plastic surgeon who was thinking more like an artist. He wanted to give people tails and wings and horns and really anything they could imagine he wanted to be able to do to you or with you. He was very collaborative also and had beautiful watercolors of what this might be like. And I just thought, wow, this guy rocks. It's really a pity that he'll lose his license if he does any of this. And then I was thinking, well, what kind of person would want to work with this doctor? Who would go to him and say, please give me wings? And I thought, well, maybe it's like being transgender, where you feel like you really need the wings because that's who you are. You know, maybe this is someone who thinks she's a bird. And so I knew everything about her. I knew just what she was like. But I had no story for her to be in. She had nothing to do. She just was. And when Wayne said, make me a dark fairy tale, I thought, yeah, she wants to be in that. That is her story. And then I sat around for months wondering how to get there. And I thought, well, how does she even think she's a bird? I mean, what would give her, what makes her not a crazy person thinking she's a bird? And it's like, well, what if she really is a bird? You know, what if she's just looking like a girl and she's got the hollow bones and she's got the family credentials here? What if her mom's a raven? Yeah, that would be good. Because, you know, ravens are really smart and have all these wonderful attributes, and you could see, you know, falling in love with one. I could anyway. And I thought, well, okay, so her mom's a raven, and that's all mythological and extraordinary. Who's her dad? And I thought, well, her dad's a postman. Isn't that good? You know, they meet when he tries to deliver a letter to this big nest. So they meet, and they develop this nice relationship, and then there's this very discreet pause on the page, and then they have an egg. and eventually the egg cracks, and it's this baby girl. And when she grows up, she's a little unhappy, not in a big way, because she has nice parents and everything's great, but she just knows that she's not quite what she's supposed to be. And she can't speak, she can only make raven sounds. And if you know ravens very well, you know they can imitate human speech, but she just kind of makes these squawky noises. So she goes off to university, she meets this very avant-garde plastic surgeon, and whoa, you know. I mean, I won't tell you the ending or anything, but that's the setup. The great thing about a fairy tale is that when you're writing one, you don't have to support everything so much. It's not like a modern novel where everything has to be psychologically supported and given all this underpinning. You know, well, why is she like that? Well, she just is. And so there's a certain amount of explaining, but mostly it's just chop, chop, reader, get with it. You know, come along, please. And, you know, if you're not that kind of person, if you really, really want it to be all, you know, Canadian and realistic and all those excellent Alice Munro kind of things, well, that's fantastic because Alice Munro is really prolific and excellent, but I can't do that at all. So my thing is one of those things that kind of demands that the reader be willing to go there, and if you like that kind of thing, this is the kind of thing that you like.
Thank you. It's very interesting because then you say that the nature of fairy tale is that you can go straight into the story and anything possible can happen. Philip Pullman, writing in the introduction to his retellings of the Grimm's fairy tales, talks about the way action happens from the first moment, the first line of a fairy tale. And one of the great things about your story is the first line. Once there was a postman who fell in love with a raven. It's happening, you're right in there, you're right in the story to begin with. What I wanted to ask you both is that for both of you, these books are a kind of a leap, which is appropriate, given we're talking about ballet and Nijinsky. Lucy, you are a historian who has specialised not only in Indian princesses, but also in the 18th century. You've taken up this whole new area going into ballet and a whole different period. I'm very interested in what the thinking was behind that. How did you come to it? Why did you recognise that this was your story? And then I'm going to ask you, Audrey, a bit about the leap you made from novel to fairy tale too.
I was always interested in the Ballets Russes, idly interested, back burner, nothing I was ever going to do anything about. And then there was a wonderful exhibition on Diaghilev and the Ballets Russes, and I thought, brilliant, I can write an article about that, and then that will satisfy my curiosity about it, and it'll be fine. So I rang up someone I knew at a magazine and said, could I do the article that I'm sure you'll be doing on this exhibition? She said, yeah, of course, call me again in a couple of months and we'll talk about it then. So I waited, and then I called her and she said, I'm really sorry, my editor's given it to someone else. So I was like, quickly rang up the press office of the V&A and said, do you know anywhere that I can write an article? I know it's really late notice at this stage, I'd kind of left it a bit late. And they said, oh, come in and talk to us. And so I went in and spoke to them, and I got an early view of the exhibition, and they took me to the ballet. We went to see Petrushka, and me and some other, they did a sort of, field trip for journalists. And there was a tour of Paris, which I couldn't go to, and I just got more and more interested in it. And eventually found myself speaking to another journalist at the Sunday Times, who I knew vaguely, really haven't spoken to her since, but I said, have you got an article on this coming out? Is there anything I could do for you? And she said, well, I can't remember why they couldn't do it, but she said, well, why don't you write a book about it if you're so interested? And I said, well, I can't possibly do that. I don't know anything about dance, and, it's just, I'll be laughed out of town if I try and write a book about an icon like Nijinsky. And she said, actually, dance is quite inward looking, and maybe it would be nice to see something. I started as a dance critic. Don't feel restrained by the fact that you don't know anything about ballet. And in a way,
it has the advantage that you mediate for a less specialist audience, don't you, when you take a subject?
Exactly. And I had been reading about it, and I hadn't found a book sort of, in many ways I think you write a book that you want to read, and that there wasn't something that was general. A lot of the books on the Ballets Russes, though they're brilliant, assume a lot of knowledge and a lot of understanding of the later politics. It's so political. So anyway, that's how I got into it, and the journey of doing it, I think, was so much fun. I mean, I went off to ballet lessons, not that helped, I haven't written about it, but part of it, I saw an awful lot of ballet, and I had, I feel like I've got this new world now, which I'm absolutely enraptured by, and I didn't, the thought of sitting next to Audrey has had me in, all excited for weeks. So, you know, it's been this amazing discovery for me, a wonderful new world. I've loved
And the
it.
book, of course, takes the reader on a similar journey of discovery because you have the sense of excitement of finding the things that engaged you, I think.
Yes.
And you don't necessarily have to be a specialist. Well, the leap that you made, Audrey, obviously going from writing fiction, long fiction, to writing a short fairy tale, it was a whole different flavour to the story, wasn't it? What did you research? You weren't particularly interested in dance like Lucy. You weren't a follower of it, and you weren't particularly, you said, a reader of fairy tales. So how did you steep yourself in that?
Well, of course, everybody probably has read fairy tales. I mean, they get into your DNA as a reader from the time you're quite young. So to return to them, I mean, often you bring an adult understanding and you think, oh my goodness, that's for children? Oh no. But I had been thinking about them for a while for a couple of reasons. One was that a few years ago, The Guardian asked a few people to write fairy tales, and I wrote a story that has fairies in it, but is not a fairy tale. It's about some fairies who pick up a guy at a bar and force him to take them home with him.
As they do.
That sounds far more wicked than it really is. But I thought, well, okay, I failed to write a fairy tale. I wrote a story about fairies and their nefarious doings in bars. So I was thinking about it, and then I was up in Edinburgh 2 years ago and was doing an event with Neil Gaiman, and it turned into Neil and I sitting there for the hour analyzing Hansel and Gretel. I don't remember how that happened, but it was really stupendously interesting and one of those great kind of crowd participatory experiences, because everybody knows Hansel and Gretel. And I thought, wow, these stories really, they really get their claws into you. And at that time, I was just starting to work with Wayne and thinking about why, for example, fairy tales are so often made into very good ballets, because they just tap into some things about the kind of stories that are possible to tell in ballet. I think you need very archetypical characters. You can't, there's things ballet can't really do because it doesn't have any words, and other things that it can do supremely because it's there happening in front of you, and it's expressive and it's moving. And so the fairy tale seems well suited to telling that kind of story. The ballet is well suited to telling a fairy tale kind of story.
Because it uses archetypes partly. But one of the things, again, Pullman talking about it, talks about the two-dimensionality and the archetypal quality of fairy tale characters. But you've actually tried in Raven Girl to give the characters a bit more psychological depth than is common in fairy tale.
It's like the same thing that happened in the Guardian thing where I resisted. I wanted to give in completely and be, a fake, grim girl. But I couldn't, because I'm not from that century and I can't really go there. So in essence, it's a kind of hybrid between the kind of character you would find in the classic fairy tales and the kind of character you would find in modern fiction.
Yes, and of course it's got modern details. The email and so on doesn't appear in a lot of fairy tales as we know them, even though it
not yet
has other kinds of resonances that are familiar.
Yeah.
You talked about what dance can do and can't do. I'm interested in, for both of you, what is different for you in your experience of dance in relation to the things that you're writing, in terms of what can dance do as narrative that writing can't? Do you think, you talked about Nijinsky's soul being in the dance. What is it in expressive dance that we see that we don't see when you're putting something down on paper that's in words?
Well, funny enough, as you were talking earlier and talking about these two-dimensional characters, I think that was what Nijinsky's genius as a performer was. We haven't, talked about him as a choreographer, but as a performer, it was that he was able to make these characters kind of four-dimensional almost. And I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, the closest experience I've had to seeing Nijinsky dance, I went to see The Metamorphosis the other day, which is, Kafka's novel, as a ballet, and it was utterly extraordinary. But that's a work that you think of as, obviously it's a novel. It's very literary. It's not something you could possibly. I could never have imagined it would be as good as it was. But it was something that was created. Although the novel was written obviously separately, the ballet, the music, the sets, the costumes, I think even the dancers were all working together to create it. So it was very much in that tradition of the Ballets Russes, kind of the total work of art that is created for that moment, rather than a story being tacked onto a bit of music, being tacked onto, a dancer, or, they often use different costume. The costume from one ballet would be used for another ballet. Diaghilev, at the first season used a bit of music, pieced together all sorts of different bits of music for various things. But when it worked, it was because everybody was in it together, just as you describe. And that for me was absolutely, I felt that was when I felt the closest sort of I've experienced as an audience member, seeing something where it's just literally I sat with my jaw open for 70 minutes watching it. And I think it's because of that the sense of the total work of art.
And the power of collaboration rather than one individual voice.
Yeah, something you're making me think of is the fact that in a collaboration, everybody has to hold back a little and make space for the other people to be in there with you.
Yes.
And I think one of the great things about a flat character is that the dancer can move in and take over.
And it's a collaboration between them, isn't it? It's the character and the dancer.
Yeah, but one of the things that's been extraordinary about watching these things get made is watching how, for example, Vicky Mortimer is making the sets and the costumes. And so one rehearsal that I saw, she had made this corset that's going to be put on the Raven Girl by the doctor because there's this moment when she doesn't have arms. And so suddenly this dancer's like this. And so, I mean, the costume makers are shaping the body of this dancer, but the two dancers in that scene are dealing with it. And so there's this back and forth between every single person who's touching this dance.
Yes.
And you can just feel the energy and the ideas being passed around, and everybody's listening.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. And you think, well, at the beginning, with Diaghilev and everyone, that same thing, who knew what it was going to be? It was wide open.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't mentioned is the aquatints, which illustrate Raven Girl. Tell us a little bit about those, because, of course, part of the inspiration is the images as well as the story for the dance.
Well, Wayne, I think, would have liked the words to completely disappear and for it to be entirely aquatints. I mean, which is fine. It would have been fantastic, except for that I did all the aquatints in 12 weeks because we suddenly had a date for the premiere. And I had a little freak out when I visited my publisher in New York, and I said, so what's the schedule? And they said, well, you deliver September 5th. And I went, oh! And so,
yes, what we haven't said is that you're also practicing trained artist, and so it's not just the text that you did, but the images.
Well, Wayne had seen a book called The Adventuress, which I made when I was an art student. So I made it between 1983 and 1985, which is almost entirely aquatints and has very little text. And so he liked that because of this open space thing. It had so much empty space and so much ambiguity, and he was excited by all the things that weren't in there, which I realize sounds a little weird, but for a collaboration, that's a good thing where it's much easier to make a good movie out of a short story than a novel because you can expand. And that was what Wayne wanted to do. He wanted to move in and expand. And so what I tried to give him, what I tried to do was go back to the self that made those pictures and make pictures kind of like that. It's impossible to really be your earlier self, but he had very clearly indicated what he did and didn't like, and so I was trying to give that to him so that he could do whatever it was he had in mind.
I quite like the statement coming from Audrey Niffenegger that it's impossible to be your earlier self, given that the book that we all know her for is The Time Traveller's Wife. In fact, I want to bring up this theme of the relationship to time in both these books. Dance, as you said, is very much in the moment. And one of the ways you treat Nijinsky's story is to take those pivotal moments and to take the dance, as it were, as the significant episodes in his life. You too, Audrey, obviously, I imagine that one of the inspirations for The Time Traveller's Wife was the way every moment of our lives and of relationships in particular contains the present and the past and the future. And it was a recognition, wasn't it, well, it seemed to me that it was a recognition of the fact that in every relationship we're thinking of all those things. A relationship that's gone on for a long time partly is what it is because of the shared past. A relationship at the beginning is thinking, will it last? Will it be painful if it comes to an end? There's time mashes together in relationships, doesn't it? So both of you took an approach where you thought about time in relation to those books, not only in that past one, but in this one too, because a fairy tale is very much now in the action. Can you expand? It's a rather complicated question, but can you expand on that a bit?
Well, what it makes me think of is when Nijinsky started going mad, he wrote this diary manically for about 6 weeks, all the time. And in it there are lots of his memories of his performances, of his relationships with other artists, with Diaghilev, with Romola. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about it, and which was partly a sort of, you can see it in Charleston as well, this kind of modernist idea of the splinteredness of the individual and the way that we view people, people you're close to, you see in a multiplicity of ways. You may love them generally, but you also can hate them at times. You can wish you were, there are so many different ways you can see people simultaneously. And so for me, that was something that was really interesting about Nijinsky, and I think it was something that he carried in his work, and I think it was something that placed him very much in that the greater world of art at his time, the sort of modernist artists. So time, but also identity, for me, are very connected, or were very connected when I was thinking about Nijinsky.
That's interesting, like Cubism or something.
Yeah.
He's conveying a lot of points of view simultaneously.
Yes, exactly. And they're not untrue. They're all true. They're just different prisms. Prisms, bits of a glass.
Yes. Audrey, do you think that in fairy tale time has a different quality from the other kinds of narrative that you might be writing?
It's almost more like timelessness, don't you think? I mean, once upon a time. Well, when was that? Well, it was not now, usually. And of course, the Grimm brothers, they were collecting folk tales, and they weren't thinking about children. They were collecting tales that people tell each other by the hearth, and just funny little things that people were circulating. And so these tales probably had a pretty long oral history before they ever got written down. And I think when you hear the word fairy tale, you think of, princesses with ball gowns and...
You do now.
Yeah. I mean, back then it was just, they were telling stories about kings and queens and frogs. And
folk stories, aren't they?
Folk stories, yeah. Hansel and Gretel, they're so poor they can't afford to... Parents can't feed them, so they stick them out in the woods. Yeah, it was a whole different ethos then, but yeah.
Social commentary, actually, Hansel and Gretel, wasn't it? Yeah. Partly. But some of those stories, of course, the Grimm's ones were quite violent. We're not pretty girls in princess dresses. And your story, Raven Girl, does go back to very basic emotions and has also quite startling, well, let's say, I don't want to spoil the ending, but there's a kind of twist in it. There's an untypical fairy tale quality to the way the story develops. What we think is going to happen doesn't quite happen. And whereas fairy tales do often have a form that you kind of know that when you do 3 good deeds, they're going to pay off later, and it will all end happily. I think you've played with the genre in a way, made it a slightly different sort of form.
Well, as usual, I've probably caused a lot of people to think, well, that's all wrong. What is she doing? But on the other hand, hopefully when you don't quite proceed according to the form, people are more inclined to pay attention and to be thinking about it longer if you don't just do the expected thing.
I think one of the things that's also interesting about both your books is this notion of a victim. The question is whether the Raven Girl in your story is somehow a victim who becomes a heroine, or the other way around. What sort of victimization is there in that?
Oh no, I think she's quite empowered. At the time I was writing it, I was enduring a season at the Lyric Opera in Chicago where every soprano dies at the end. And I'm like, no, not again, a wizza. And so I'm like, no way is anything terrible going to happen to my nice little Raven Girl. Other characters, sure, yeah, we can kill them. But yeah, it was just a conscious effort to not do that fairy tale Little Mermaid thing, no. So...
It's interesting that Nijinsky is also, you can perceive him as both hero and victim. He was a victim in some ways of Diaghilev, who ensnared him, and he enslaved him, if you like.
Yes.
He was a victim of the treatments that he endured. Later, he was a victim of his political circumstances.
Yeah. Victim of his wife, you might say, but also protected by him and looked after by him and nurtured by her and looked after by her in some ways too. Yes, I think what's interesting about Nijinsky is there's so little. He seems so unaware of that quality in himself, but his passivity is something that strikes the observer of his life very strongly. And it was definitely, in some ways, Diaghilev was just the audience kind of magnified. I thought a lot about, there's this moment where Marie Rambert describes in the spring of 1913 when they're practicing for the Rite of Spring, and Nijinsky's still dancing at that stage, not in the Rite of Spring but in other ballets, and Marie Rambert, who's just joined the ballet as Nijinsky's sort of assistant on the Rite of Spring, is sitting next to Diaghilev in the darkened theatre watching Nijinsky rehearse, and he keeps nudging her going, look, isn't this his best role? And then the next one comes, he's at his most perfect in this. And that image of Nijinsky dancing and Diaghilev sitting in the audience, the kind of empty theatre almost, was for me where they're the sort of the best of their relationship. I think Nijinsky kind of needed Diaghilev he was the one who could understand what Nijinsky was portraying on stage. Not always, I think maybe at the end, Nijinsky wanted to move in artistic ways that Diaghilev wasn't really interested in. But so there's a sense of passivity, and I don't think that Nijinsky ever felt like that about himself. I think he felt that he was an artist struggling to express himself, and I don't think he for a moment felt that he was a victim.
What about later, when he was he received electric shock therapy,
Yes.
and he received
The
medicine
most
that affected
hideous,
his character?
Yes, well, I think some of his friends said that they thought it was a kind of voluntary retreat from a harsh world, and there are certainly views of mental illness which suggest that, it's a retreat from a world that you don't want to live in, and I'm sure there was an element of that with Nijinsky, that the real world was not the same as the world he inhabited on stage and the world he inhabited when he was practicing, and yes, I found that very poignant to think about and write about, and yeah.
Do you think, like the Raven Girl, he was somebody who didn't feel right in his own body, despite all these amazing things that he could do? He felt as if
I think he
needed
only
wings.
felt right when he was doing those things. I don't think he felt comfortable off stage. I really don't. And that's a very romantic view. I've obviously been swept away too much by what I was by the people the accounts I've read of him. But that's what Nureyev thought when he sort of discusses in his own memoirs. Nijinsky, actually I don't know if it's in his memoirs, forgive me, but it is Nureyev, and he said Nijinsky went mad because he couldn't dance, and he's someone who would know. He was subject to a lot of the same strains.
Yes, interesting. When one of the things I thought was very interesting about your book is that you've steeped yourself so much in the ballet that in the end you wrote a divertissement, which is a sort
So I'm
of
a
the
little
ballet that,
embarrassed about
as it would
that.
be danced,
Yes.
of Nijinsky's life.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that. That was wonderful that the form took over into the writing.
It did. I wasn't quite sure. I really asked my editor very strongly whether I should take it out, and they sort of passed it around the office, and they all came back and said, no, it's fine. And I've been waiting with the reviews to have it torn to shreds, but so far no one has. I just sort of I thought, I don't know anything about this. I'll try and write a kind of libretto for a ballet. You know, his life is like a fairy tale in some ways, and so off I went. It's not very long. Forgive me for it if you...
It's sort of astonishing, really, that somebody hasn't...
Someone has, John Newmeyer,
okay.
who's a great choreographer and has a sort of... I mean, people are so obsessed by Nijinsky, it's fascinating, and he's written a ballet about his life. And there was a wonderful... In fact, it was not Wayne McGregor, it was the other Wayne... Eagling. Did a fantastic, choreographed a fantastic version of Je for the English National Ballet, and that has scenes from Nijinsky's life interwoven into it.
Which is the ballet partly set in Bloomsbury Square, and therefore owing something to...
Exactly. Well, Duncan Grant sketched Nijinsky, so it's very... Anyway.
So there's a beautiful circularity about it. But the divertissement is, in effect, 3 acts expressing the story of Nijinsky's life as you invented it.
I originally did it as an exercise in kind of seeing the, what I thought was the dramatic structure. I never really imagined it would go into the book anyway.
Sometimes those are the best things.
Did you surprise yourself with the form of Raven Girl? Did it take a different shape from the one that you originally imagined?
Slightly, but for practical reasons. When Wayne and I were originally talking about this, he was imagining a longer ballet with an intermission. And so the story naturally falls into 2 parts. And when he decided it would be about an hour long and be danced all the way through with no intermission, I needed to integrate things more. But it still definitely has kind of a before and after.
I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. I realise we're running out of time. There are a couple of mics, if you just wait for them. This lady over here first, if that's okay, quite close to you. And then perhaps we'll line up another one in a minute. Is there a second mic somewhere? Or is it just you? Yes, do stand up, thank you. Yes.
You were talking about time and fairy tales being sort of timeless and or set almost outside of time. Is Raven Girl like that? Is it a modern ballet, or is there is it set in a time?
It's definitely now. If you could see the props, I mean, the postman rides a bicycle. It's definitely of the moment. Yeah.
He worries about email.
Yeah, he has nightmares about email.
But of course, it may on stage have a slightly more timeless quality than on the page, perhaps.
Well, the humans are also interacting with nature, the ravens, and nature. Well, I mean, these days you can often see what's becoming of nature, and it's a little more dated by our activities a little bit. But for a long time, nature just kind of was what it was, so timeless as it can be.
I wondered if you chose birds as a theme partly because of their potential in dance.
Well, like I said, I already had a character, but she seemed dance-ish, as though she would be a good sort of character that could be in a ballet without stretching it too much. I mean, if you were going to do a ballet about wrestlers, that might be a little weird, because none of those dancers look like wrestlers, and if you got wrestlers, they couldn't move like dancers, so that's never going to happen, probably. But birds, that works.
It's a challenge. I think we should think about it. Yes. Bill, yeah, go ahead.
The other day I went to see The Great Gatsby as a ballet, and what struck me very strongly about that was how difficult it is in ballet to tell a narrative, a complex narrative, and for that reason it kind of didn't quite work, I thought. Now here you are a storyteller. What did you have to do to your Raven Girl story to make it read through ballet where you have no words and I presume you have no words, is that correct?
No words.
No words. How do you solve that problem?
I'm going to find out Friday night. Because it's not my problem.
Well, except it is your problem in the sense that when you originally constructed your story, you knew it was for a ballet, yes?
Yes, but I gave them dialogue and internal monologue and all sorts of things that are never making it onto the stage. So what Wayne said to me, I said, is this danceable? And he said, don't worry about that, just tell the story and I'll worry about the dance.
Have you not seen a rehearsal?
I haven't seen a rehearsal,
so
it looks
you
brilliant.
know the answer.
Yeah, I haven't seen the entire thing rehearsed in order. I'm seeing that Friday morning. I mean, I live in Chicago, you know, so I've been coming over here and peeking at whatever I can peek at. I mean, what's amazing to me is how narrative it actually is. Because, I mean, Wayne kind of said, oh, well, you know, it might not exactly be all that narrative. And, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, but he kind of warned me not to expect a very old-fashioned kind of ballet. But he's been pretty faithful to the story. And the ways they eliminated a character that I have in there, for example. But in order to tell this story, they've translated things that were inner in the story into action and movement and expression and, you know, interaction between dancers that was once dialogue.
So did you conceive it as being a sequence of emotions? I suppose that's what because it seems to me that's what ballet deals in.
It's a sequence of emotions, but also it's a sequence of actions and thoughts that are not terribly emotional. So it's not just pure emotion rendered in words. It has more structure than that.
It sounds to me as though you're thinking more about the fairy tale than about the dance when you wrote it. Or at
Yeah,
least
absolutely, because that's what I was given to do. And if I knew more about dance, maybe I would have written something that was dance-ish, but maybe that would have been bad. You know, sometimes when you're collaborating, it's better to leave the parts that you're not doing to the person who's really going to do them fantastically. If I started having ideas about dance, I think Wayne would just look at me funny. So fortunately, I don't.
Any more questions? Yes. Lady over there.
Question to Audrey. Wouldn't you have said that The Time Traveller's Wife is in its way a fairy story?
I wouldn't really, but what makes you think that yourself?
That it's not, in some ways, it's not based in reality. You have to use your imagination and stretch your imagination.
No, what I think of it as is something called speculative fiction, which is a very particular neighborhood in the world of science fiction. The fairy tale, I think, is a very defined form. And with The Time Traveler's Wife, I was free to work very novelistically. And so the characters are very fleshed out. The problems are very modern problems having to do with relationships and emotional states and practical problems. But there's never... Speculative fiction I would define as fiction where you just change one rule about the world and everything else you stick with the rules of the world and you go see how that thought experiment plays out.
It's interesting when you're talking about the thoughts that are inexpressible. One of the things that you do in your book, Lucy, is that you imagine what Nijinsky is thinking. That's an interesting... Biographers are divided really into those that will do that and those who won't, those who will tell what you could know. But you do slightly fictionalize it. You do infer what he might have been thinking in the wings at the Rite of Spring, for instance.
I did.
How far did that go?
Well, I did it again as a sort of experiment to start with. I tried to do the first performance of the Rite of Spring as a sort of from Nijinsky's point of view in an imaginative way. I mean, every single fact that's in there is something that I researched, but I did take that leap for the first 5 pages, and it's not something I'd done before. I was quite reluctant about it. I'd always deeply disapproved of people who did it, and so I just sort of I wanted to take that extra leap. I mean, I didn't identify with him. I don't think, but I was passionately interested in what it had felt like, and so yeah, again, it was something that I did as an exercise for myself to try and work out, and I ended up liking it and sort of start and I think it was meant to be an exercise purely for myself to see whether I could imagine it more fully, and then it became something, it went into my proposal, and then it sort of was stuck there. But
I wonder, if you don't mind me asking a question, how do you stop a real person from becoming a character?
It's really, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I guess you always are creating a character when you write a biography. Of course you are.
I just wondered, because all the things I'm trying to do, I would imagine you're trying to stop
Do the
from
opposite.
happening.
Yes. Well, funny enough, I mean, the reason I think that I felt like doing it with this was because I tried and failed to write a novel, done really badly with it. But I'd learned a lot about sort of viewpoint and, you know, the kind of tricks in a way, and so I felt I might try them out. And but I don't think I could lose that control. I think you either have it or you don't. So, you know, you might not be able to have the accuracy
I would be useless,
that I'd be seeking.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I had the opposite experience writing a biography, where I wouldn't allow myself to do that thing of assuming that I knew the character's thoughts, that everything in it had to be researched.
Yeah.
And partly because then you worry about how close you got to the truth. But what you say about viewpoint is how you tell the story. You explore the narrative so that you come at it from different angles and shape it, not necessarily by telling you what you're thinking. But it is very different from writing a novel, certainly.
Yes. Sorry, I've got them. So, no, it's a privileged position. I just wanted to ask you both a little bit about the music. Actually, Lucy, you did actually, you started to answer that question, but at the very beginning, when you spoke, you said your starting point actually was the Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring, and it is an anniversary this year. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, and also Audrey, I don't know anything about the music for Raven Girl, so that's a question for both of you.
Well, for me, it was more the ballet and the music. And that moment of the premiere, that summer where they had these 9 performances, which were never again performed together, and I felt that Nijinsky had been rather hard done by. You know, he'd broken with Diaghilev afterwards partly because his choreography wasn't commercial enough. Stravinsky, on the other hand, you know, almost immediately was able to translate the right into concert music and to sort of. It became, because people were able to listen to it again and again, they were able to get used to what was shocking about it. And with Nijinsky, he didn't have that luxury. No one was watching his movements again. No one was seeing his vision of it. And it was so collaborative. It was so collaborative that that Stravinsky marked the stamping of the dancers on his score as part of the orchestral score. So. It was more that the more I learned about the creation of the piece and the first few performances, I felt that Nijinsky had been kind of excluded by virtue of not having a voice later on. And the others had years, decades to present their own version of how brilliant they'd been, and Nijinsky hadn't had it.
And tell us about your music.
The music for Raven Girl was written by Gabriel Yared, who is a composer. He's Lebanese and he lives in Paris. And you will probably have heard actually a lot of his music because he's done scores for a number of films. He won an Oscar for The English Patient. And he did Betty Blue and The Lives of Others and just loads and loads. Just go with Wikipedia. Because he's really, really interesting. And my first experience of the music was Gabriel sending me all these little MP3 files and listening very close on my computer speakers and thinking, well, that sounds small. And so recently, a couple of weeks ago, I went to the first orchestral rehearsal and sat in the big main theater. And Gabriel was sitting in the front row and giving feedback to the musicians and the conductor. And so suddenly it went from being this tiny little thing to being this huge, amazing sound which the musicians were playing together for the first time. But the thing about anything to do with the Royal Ballet is that everybody's so genius that doing it for the first time, it looks fantastic to me, you know, because what do I know? But they kept stopping and starting and changing it around, but then eventually they'd play something through and you just sort of get lost in it because it's crazy because it's both very lush and romantic and also kind of edgy and creepy in different parts. And I just thought, wow, this is so well suited. And because I'd been watching a rehearsal the day before to a piano score of the same thing, I knew what I would be seeing when I was hearing what I was hearing. And so I started to imagine how it would all be when it came together. So when I go to the dress rehearsal on Friday, I'll suddenly actually see that. But the music's actually incredibly gorgeous.
Sounds as though it's both natural and experimental. It sounds as though maybe it owes something to Stravinsky. Is this possible?
Well, I mean, at this point, who doesn't, you know?
Indeed. Any more questions out there? Yes, gentleman in the white.
Nijinsky was operating in an area of an amazing conglomeration of talent. And you have the sense, obviously, that Diaghilev was very much the showman and knew exactly what he was doing. And probably so did Stravinsky. Was Diaghilev there with it? Was it a competitive collaboration? Or was he just turning up and card punching and he happened to be a dancer?
Oh, I think they all were enthralled to Diaghilev's idea of what they could create together. And I think, well, I know, because of what Nijinsky himself wrote, what he wrote and what his sister wrote, that he felt that he couldn't contribute. They would always go out for lunch every day, these long kind of boozy lunches, it sounds like, with Benoit, Bax, Diaghilev. Later on it would be Picasso, these incredible meetings of creative minds. And Nijinsky never uttered a word, apparently, and Diaghilev apparently told him to keep quiet. He was better that he didn't try and contribute. And when he did contribute, they would, dismiss him. Diaghilev was dismissive of him. When he created L'Après-midi d'une Faune, Diaghilev used to joke that he'd sent him to the Louvre to look at Greek vases for inspiration for it, but he got lost on the Egyptian floor, and that's why it was done in profile. Just dismissive, cutting things all the time. And Nijinsky was half their age. They dismissed him as a kind of immature kid. He was a sort of idiot savant. But he was a lot younger than them, and he saw them as being the great geniuses of his age, really. And so they were running their own competitive little club, I think. And the kind of the rivalry between, say, Bax and Benoit, the two great set designers of that early period, was fierce and intense, and they loathed each other. Fokine, the other choreographer, who Nijinsky sort of replaced, and who then schemed really to get back into the Ballets Russes after Nijinsky was sacked. Again, these very, very bitter personal rivalries. And Diaghilev liked to think of himself as sitting above it, controlling it all, but he was, of course, part of it too. I think the best comment on it was the press officer for the Met when they went to America during the First World War. He said he'd never known such a group of kind of medieval intrigue among a group of people.
I want to, if I may, to ask you a last question, which is that I think both these works are about love and identity. One of the central themes of your book about Nijinsky is what his sexual identity was, and the drama of it is partly the drama of his sexual development. Your story is what looks like it's going to be a love story and turns out to be more about finding the self. Tell us a little bit about those themes.
I'd say Nijinsky is a little bit about looking like a love story and then finding the self. It just didn't happen, it happened in a tragic way rather than in an empowering way. I think there's a wonderful quote about Nijinsky putting on the pearl choker of his first kind of great role and sending this most homosexual of centuries on its vertiginous course. And so I think there's a sense that Diaghilev and Nijinsky were held up as icons of a kind of new way of being, and Nijinsky was unwittingly became an icon and a beacon for people who wanted to, who liked Duncan Grant. But he was a young boy who wasn't really sure about him. I don't think he ever had time really to grow up, and because he grew up in the public eye, I think that that development was arrested anyway. And so you got the sense that almost that he went mad because everything was so confused for him.
Jeanette Winterson said, "Never grow up in public. It's a bad idea." Yes. Now tell us about the theme of love and identity in The Raven Girl.
Often in fairy tales, the reward for all the travails that the characters go through is to marry the princess or to marry the prince or whoever happens to be available who's of the appropriate gender. So I thought, well, that's amusing. We should do that, but not before a lot of crazy stuff happens that makes you think there will be no prince. It's funny because in the ballet, he's really taken this love idea and expanded and, kind of enlarged certain things that are implicit in the story. It's hard to talk about this without spoilers. But the part of the point for me about the story is that the girl, she pursues herself. She's trying to find her true self. And the men around her, some of them help her and some of them hinder, but none of them are transforming her by being in love with her until she has her true self, which she has achieved. It isn't something that's bestowed on her as a present in exchange for good behavior. She's not, in fact, all that well behaved. And so she gets her true self in exchange for being brave and willing, rather than in exchange for being docile and obedient. So I guess if there's any moral at all, that would be the one. Be your true self because you should and you can, not because that's what everybody's telling you to do.
Which is a good note to end on. Thank you very much for wonderful thoughts you shared.
It was wonderful to bring Nijinsky to Charleston. For those of you who know the house, in the studio, on the mantelpiece of the studio, there's a cutout from a newspaper article, I think. No?
No.
What?
A very, very rare early photograph of Nijinsky.
It's a photograph. I didn't know whether it was from a newspaper or not, but it's a very rare early photograph of Nijinsky on the mantelpiece of the studio in Charleston. So, most of you probably have been to the house, but have a look at it next time. So, and obviously we wish you luck with the ballet on Friday. And thank you very much, Nicolette, for drawing out all the common themes. And I have to say they're both very beautiful, apart from the subject matter. Both of the books are very beautiful. Obviously, Audrey's book is very artistic, with the aquatints that have already been referred to, and there are lots of beautiful illustrations in Lucy's book as well. So we'll give them one more round of thanks, and then if you wait here for a moment, they'll be at the back of the bookstall, happy to sign copies of their books. Thank you all very much.